The first-class cabin of Flight 742 was a world of its own, a place where luxury wasn't just expected, it was assumed. Plush leather seats reclined effortlessly at the touch of a button, and a soft golden glow from overhead lighting reflected off polished mahogany accents. Flight attendants moved gracefully, offering pre-flight champagne to passengers who barely looked up from their designer phones and business-class laptops. It was the kind of place where people weren't just flying. They were arriving, long before the plane even left the ground. Victor Reynolds settled comfortably into his seat near the window, a smirk playing on his lips. This was where he belonged. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, making all the right connections, and earning a lifestyle most people could only dream of. As he adjusted his Rolex and reached for his glass of champagne, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Another passenger was being escorted down the aisle toward the seat next to him. Victor barely glanced up until the man stopped right beside him, and instantly his smirk faded. The man standing there wasn't dressed like the others in first class. No tailored suit, no gold cufflinks, no watch worth a small fortune. Instead, he wore a simple black hoodie, a comfortable pair of jeans, and a relaxed expression, as if he had nowhere to be in a hurry. He carried a single backpack slung over one shoulder, no designer luggage in sight. Victor's lips pressed into a thin line as he quickly scanned the man's face. He was older, but carried himself with the ease of someone completely unbothered by his surroundings. Victor sighed loudly, shaking his head. Great. First class isn't what it used to be. The flight attendant, ever professional, gestured to the empty seat beside Victor and spoke with a polite smile. "Here's your seat, sir." Victor watched as the man nodded in thanks and began stowing his backpack under the seat in front of him. That's when Victor leaned toward the flight attendant and lowered his voice, just enough for her to hear. "Are you sure this is first class?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback. "Yes, sir." Victor let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, making sure the man beside him could hear it. The flight attendant, sensing the tension, quickly excused herself. Victor turned his head, giving the man a once-over, before shaking his head in quiet disapproval. He muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard, "They'll let just anyone up here these days." The man beside him? He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the comment. Instead, he simply adjusted his seatbelt, leaned back slightly, and gave a small, knowing smile. Victor frowned. He had expected a reaction, a stammered apology, an awkward chuckle, something that confirmed what he already believed. But instead, the man beside him looked completely at ease, as if he had nothing to prove, as if he had been here before. And in just a few moments, Victor would realize exactly who he was sitting next to, and why his attitude would soon come back to haunt him. Victor shifted in his seat, still annoyed by the presence of the man beside him. He had paid a small fortune for this first-class seat, for the comfort, for the exclusivity, for the experience. And yet, here he was, stuck next to someone who looked like they had walked straight out of a mall food court. The flight attendants made their final checks, ensuring everyone was buckled in. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Victor reached for his tablet and pretended to scroll through emails, though in reality, he was still very much aware of the man sitting next to him. He sighed again, louder this time. The man, still silent, glanced at him briefly before returning his gaze toward the window. Victor couldn't take it anymore. "So," he said, tilting his head slightly toward his seatmate, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge, "what brings you to first class today?" The man turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. Victor forced a smile, but there was nothing friendly about it. I mean, no offense, but you don't exactly look like the regular crowd up here. The man didn't seem fazed. He simply held Victor's gaze for a moment before responding in a deep, steady voice. I tell stories. Victor blinked. Stories? The man nodded. Yeah. Victor let out a short, amused laugh. He glanced around, as if looking for someone else to share his disbelief with. Stories, he repeated, shaking his head. Well, that's interesting. He had expected an answer like investment banker or tech entrepreneur. Something important, something respectable. Not stories. A flight attendant passed by, refilling glasses of champagne. Victor leaned back in his seat, adjusting his watch, and turned his attention toward a well-dressed businessman sitting across the aisle. So, Jeff, Victor said loudly, making sure his voice carried, how's the market looking these days? The businessman, dressed in a tailored navy suit, perked up and launched into a long-winded response about stocks, mergers, and real estate trends. Victor nodded enthusiastically, deliberately ignoring the man beside him. The message was clear. This is the kind of conversation we have up here, and you wouldn't understand. The plane rumbled as it lifted off the ground, climbing steadily into the sky. Victor smirked to himself. His seatmate was quiet, calm, maybe even a little embarrassed. But that smirk wouldn't last for long, because soon Victor would realize exactly who he was sitting next to, and it would be too late to take anything back. The flight leveled out, and the cabin filled with the soft murmur of passengers, ordering drinks, adjusting their seats, and settling in for the long journey. Victor, now fully ignoring the man beside him, continued his conversation with Jeff across the aisle, laughing a little too loudly, making sure everyone around him knew he was somebody important. But something strange was happening. A few rows ahead, a young woman glanced over her shoulder, her brows furrowed, and she squinted, as if trying to confirm something. Then a middle-aged man 2 seats up turned his head slightly, whispering something to his wife. Victor noticed the shift in the air. He saw the small, excited glances, the hushed voices, the way people kept looking toward the seat next to him. His smirk faded. Something was off. Then a flight attendant approached their row, stopping beside Victor's seatmate with a polite but noticeably enthusiastic smile. "Mr. Washington," she said warmly, her voice slightly hushed but full of respect. "I just wanted to say it's an honor to have you flying with us today." Victor's entire body stiffened. Wait, Mr. Washington? His eyes darted to the man beside him, the same man he had just dismissed, just mocked. And suddenly, as if a veil had been lifted, he saw it. The strong, familiar jawline, the deep, thoughtful eyes, the voice. Oh God, the voice. How had he not recognized it earlier? His mouth went dry. The man he had spent the past 20 minutes quietly insulting was Denzel Washington, the Academy Award-winning legend, one of the most respected, celebrated actors in the world. A silence fell over Victor's mind, his confidence crumbling in an instant. Passengers started murmuring now, leaning toward one another, sneaking glances, nudging their companions. Jeff, the businessman Victor had been so eager to impress, turned, eyes widening. "No way," he muttered under his breath. Victor swallowed hard, his hands suddenly clammy. How had he been so blind? The entire plane seemed to be paying attention now, waiting to see what would happen next. Denzel Washington, calm and collected as ever, turned toward Victor. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, the legendary actor did something completely unexpected. He smiled, not a smirk, not an arrogant grin, a genuine knowing smile. And then, he extended a hand. "Nice to meet you," he said smoothly. Victor hesitated, his throat dry. His own hand felt heavy as he reached out, his fingers stiff as he awkwardly shook Denzel's. He wanted to say something, anything, to fix this, to take back all the assumptions he had made. But what could he say? He had humiliated himself, and Denzel hadn't had to lift a finger to do it. He had done it all on his own. The cabin remained silent, passengers exchanging knowing glances. Some smirked, some whispered, others just sat back, enjoying the moment. As the flight continued, Victor barely said another word. "Denzel?" He simply pulled out a book and began reading, completely at peace. Victor, now painfully aware of his mistake, stole a few glances at the man he had so carelessly dismissed. This wasn't just some guy in a hoodie. This wasn't some nobody who didn't belong in first class. This was Denzel Washington. And the worst part? Denzel had never needed to prove anything to him. Victor had been so quick to judge, so desperate to show off, that he had failed to recognize someone who had achieved more than he ever would. As the flight neared its destination, Victor finally worked up the courage to speak. I didn't realize who you were," he mumbled awkwardly, forcing a weak chuckle. Denzel slowly closed his book, looking at Victor with the same patient expression he had worn from the start. Then, with that smooth, steady voice, he said something that hit Victor harder than any insult ever could. "That's the thing. You shouldn't have to." Victor froze. The words settled over him like a weight. Denzel gave him one last polite nod before returning to his book, leaving Victor to sit there, completely humbled. As the plane touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, Denzel stood, casually slinging his backpack over one shoulder. As he walked off the plane, the entire cabin watched, not with judgment, not with arrogance, but with a quiet respect for the man who had just given them all a lesson without ever raising his voice. Victor remained in his seat, still processing what had just happened. He had spent his whole life trying to prove he belonged. And yet, in the presence of true greatness, he had never felt smaller. And that was a mistake he knew he'd never make again.